Ultimecia. Despite being unanimously considered everyone's favorite Final Fantasy villain and Rita Repulsa cosplayer, not much is truly known about her character. We know she's an evil sorceress from the future where the letter C no longer exists, and she's really into compressing time. For some reason. But beyond those few relatable character traits, most of her backstory remains unclear. But what if I told you that Ultimecia isn't even her real name? Now, I know what you're thinking. Zach, did you really make an X-minute long video trying to explain how Ultimecia is really Rinoa from the future? The answer is no. That idea is stupid, and this is something much more pedantic than that. Yes, friends, we are indeed talking about a minor mistranslation. Let me begin with the conclusion. Ultimecia should have been translated as Artemisia. Now, I understand this shocking revelation may be upsetting to you, particularly after Square themselves have spent the past 20 years trying to get you to accept that, yeah, Aerith really was supposed to be Aerith, you guys, just fucking deal with it. Now here comes this big shot YouTube man with his 29 subscribers trying to convince you that the most beloved female character in Final Fantasy history was really supposed to be named after Eva Green's character in that 300 sequel nobody watched? Fair. But what if I told you that the circumstances surrounding this revelation are actually somewhat mildly interesting? First, in order to understand why her name should have been Artemisia, you must understand how this mistake was possible. Initially, I said this was a mistranslation, but it would be more accurate to say it was an error in transliteration. But Zach, I hear you ask, what does transliteration mean, and why does hearing you say it make me want to give you a wedgie? Well, you see, the Japanese writing system does not use an alphabet, but instead uses what is called a syllabary. In a syllabary, each character represents an entire syllable, as opposed to an alphabet where each character represents an individual sound or phoneme. Because of this, foreign words and names cannot be directly transcribed into the Japanese writing system, but instead must be interpreted based on how that word or name is pronounced. That is transliteration. What complicates this is that Japanese doesn't actually have characters for every syllable used by other languages, English included. This means that approximations have to be made, and although there are standards in place for this process, because of the large variety of dialects in any given language, a lot of this process comes down to the judgment of the writer, particularly for proper nouns. Thus, the English word cloud becomes crowd. The fictional name Aerith, which was derived from the English word earth, becomes Earis, and the historical name Artemisia becomes Artemisia. People who already understand this may notice a peculiarity with that last one, but I'll get back to that. When it came time to localize these games into English, the translators were then required to transliterate these names back into their original form. This was particularly difficult at the time because during that era and earlier, the translators generally had little to no communication with the original writers. Thus, it came down entirely to the translators' judgment to determine what these names were intended to be. To their credit, they have generally done a pretty damn good job at this, especially considering all the various different mythological references Final Fantasy likes to throw around. Let me illustrate how difficult this process is by using our good friend Cloud. As mentioned before, Cloud's name is written in Japanese using the characters ku, ra, u, do. Because of reasons, the u sound in ku is mostly silent, as well as the o sound in do. The a sound in ra and the u that follows are pronounced together, making the au or ow sound. The final detail is the r in ra. A common misconception is that people who speak Japanese get their r's and l's mixed up. This isn't quite accurate. Japanese doesn't actually have the R sound or an L sound. What they do have is a sound that isn't actually used in English that is sort of in between. Ra, ri, ru, re, ro. To me, it also sounds a bit like a D sound, but it's also very similar to how Spanish speakers will often pronounce their R's. Now, depending on the individual, its pronunciation can lean more towards an R or L sound due to dialect, speech patterns, or various other factors. What's important, though, is that this is the sound that is used in transliteration standards to represent both the R sound and the L sound, and that's what makes this particularly complicated. You see, because of this, the character Ra in crowd means that this could actually be transliterated into two equally correct English words, cloud and crowd. How does the translator determine which is correct if they can't ask the original writer? Context. One thing that clues us into which choice is correct is the name of Cloud's home, Nibelheim. This is actually a pun referring to both Niflheim, a world from Norse mythology, and the German words Nebel and Heim. You see, Niflheim is known as a world of mist, while the German word Nebel can mean both mist or cloud, while Heim means home. So the name of Cloud's home literally means cloud home, which is a pretty good indicator that cloud is the correct transliteration. But look at how much prerequisite knowledge was required to come to that conclusion. The translator not only needed to be fluent in both Japanese and English, but also have a decent understanding of Norse mythology and German. And this is one of the ones they got right. Once you start throwing around stuff that's more complicated or has less context, like Earis or Ultimecia, mistakes are bound to be made. So let's look back at Ultimecia. As mentioned before, this would actually be a somewhat peculiar, but not technically incorrect transliteration of the name Artemisia. Although I certainly don't know how Japanese transliteration standards may have changed since 1999, I will say that today you would generally write that name as Artemisia. You would write the syllable R as A instead of R, because current transliteration standards are based on British pronunciation. Artemisia. This is also done to help differentiate between syllables ending with an R sound or an L sound. However, it's not technically incorrect to write the syllable R as ar, just non-standard, and it's actually a very easy and common quote-unquote mistake to make. In fact, this same choice was made with the name of another character who is surprisingly related, but I'll save that for later. The other, less obvious difference is that between T and te. Japanese doesn't actually have a character for the syllable T, but rather has to use a second character to modify the character te into T. This means that the original writers had to have been quite deliberate in using T rather than te, which would seem more appropriate. I believe this change was actually made to differentiate this name from the spell Ultima, which has traditionally been written Ultima, to show that they weren't related. Ironically, this seems to have backfired when localizing the game into English, given that the historical name Artemisia was not apparent to the translators, and so something derived from the word ultimate seemed the most appropriate. Thus, Ultimecia, some sort of ultimate sorceress, I guess, who the fuck knows. Okay, so that explains how this fraudulent name Ultimecia came to be. What's actually interesting is why this character would be named Artemisia and why I'm so certain that is definitely the case. Buckle up, this is gonna get stupid. Let's talk about the Interdimensional Rift. Yeah, I'm fucking going there. The Interdimensional Rift was first established in Final Fantasy V, where it served as the final dungeon of the game. It is, obviously, a rift between dimensions, which has been used since its inception to very loosely tie all of the Final Fantasy worlds together. They're all still their own separate worlds, but there's this extra-dimensional space between them that, on rare occasions, can even allow things to pass through. The most noteworthy example of this is, of course, Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was the incompetent lackey of Final Fantasy V's antagonist, Exdeath. By the way, Exdeath actually probably should have been named Exodus, but holy fucking shit do I not have time to get into that. At the end of the game, Exdeath banishes Gilgamesh to the Rift for being too much of a fuck-up, and for a long time, that was the end of his story. Then Final Fantasy VIII came along, and everything changed. In that game, if you've acquired thick goth GF Odin, then towards the end of the game on the lunatic Pandora, yeah, it's pronounced lunatic, as in, like, moon-related. I'm sorry if I keep ruining this game for you. Anyway, when you fight Cypher on the lunatic Pandora, Odin will make a scripted appearance and attack Cypher. But Cypher, the sneaky lad, counters this with an Uno reverse card, and suddenly Odin's toast. Then the magic happens. Odin's spear tears open a portal into the Interdimensional Rift, and out pops Gilgamesh. Fans of the series are probably used to Gilgamesh's dimension-traveling antics by now, but it's very important to understand that this is the first time this had ever happened. For 12 years, each Final Fantasy world had been completely separate until this goofy fuck with cardboard cutouts for arms popped out of a hole in space. Why do I bring this up? Because there is this unseen bond between Final Fantasy V and VIII that I've found to be pretty significant to Ultimecia's character. Also, yeah, I'm gonna keep calling her Ultimecia just to make this less confusing. Additionally, the Interdimensional Rift hides another, far more important character who has for far too long gone overlooked. Back in Final Fantasy V, while Bartz and crew are exploring the Interdimensional Rift, they wander through a dissonant array of locales. One of these is a castle floating in space, aptly named Dimension Castle. Inside, the gang rescues a helpless lady from Slimy Boy Catastrophe. This feminine form turns out to be a ruse, however, a disguise worn by the king of this castle, Halicarnassus. Yeah, that's our boy. I can see history fans' brain meat churning already. First thing I want to point out, the name Halicarnassus was transliterated into Japanese as Harikarnassus. Notice how the syllable kar was once again transcribed as karu. This shows that there is indeed a precedent for this style of transliteration, meaning Ultimecia isn't a unique outlier in that regard. More importantly are the similarities this character has with Ultimecia. Take a look at the shape of both characters and you'll notice some similarities in their silhouettes, particularly in their horizontally pointy headdress. Also notice how they are both rulers of castles outside of time and space. The final thing has to do with Ultimecia's characterization. In English, Ultimecia spoke with a peculiar speech pattern that was depicted by replacing the letter C with the letter K in all of her dialogue. This gave her a somewhat alien and maybe even harsh tone. A similar effect was accomplished in Japanese, but the manner in which it was achieved was far different and left what I feel is an important part of her character to be lost in translation. In Japanese, Ultimecia speaks in a very masculine manner, such as using the word omae to refer to the player's party. The effect this creates is similar, but is far more consequential when taken into consideration with not only Halicarnassus, but the other major sorceress we all know and love, Adele. This beefy hunk of magic is quite unambiguously female. You heard that right. Obviously, anyone who's played the game knows this and was probably confused by it as well. What's important to take away from this is this common trend between the three characters. Two sorceress queens, one with a masculine form and one with a masculine manner of speech, and a sorcerer king who disguises himself as a woman. This all may seem like a bit of a stretch, which is understandable considering these similarities went largely unnoticed by the English-speaking fanbase for 2 decades. Even for me personally, living Final Fantasy encyclopedia that I am, I didn't make any sort of connection between the two characters until somewhat recently, during my latest foray into yet another game in the series. Dread it, run from it, inevitably all roads lead to Hydaelyn. Yes, friends, I am indeed dragging Final Fantasy XIV into this psychotic conspiracy theory. 14 is such a unique case in the series, even beyond being an MMO, in that it gives the most direct acknowledgement of the multiverse since, well, pretty much when Gilgy popped out of that hole in space. The world of Hydaelyn is the Mother Crystal, known as the Source. According to the game's lore, there were 13 fragments of the Source that broke apart, creating reflections of the Source's light. These 13 shards? Well, they're the worlds of the other Final Fantasy games. This is why characters like Xande, the Warring Triad, Kryl, and Matoya can appear in forms very similar to their original games, but still be entirely separate people. Lore-wise, those from the original games are simply reflections of their counterparts from the source. This is all retroactive as hell, sure, but it has actually been used to pretty great effect in 14 to establish an interesting world while giving an excuse to continue to stuff the game full of fanservice-y bullshit, which I 100% appreciate. Fuck yeah, I want to talk to some brooms. Along with the game's Stormblood expansion and the accompanying raid series came probably the game's most blatant fan service in the form of the series' other dimension-traveling staple, Omega. Omega is a superpowered destruction machine of unknown origin who is also introduced in Final Fantasy V in the Rift. He wanders the cosmos searching for each world's most powerful entity. Upon encountering him in 14, he challenges you to fight replications of some of the specimens he observed from other worlds. Thus, you get to fight fan favorites like Exdeath, Kefka, Chaos, and Halicarnassus. Yeah, buddy! This rendition of the character is largely the same as in Final Fantasy V, with one major change. She is actually a queen this time. This is very significant due to the backstory your comrades managed to research regarding her. You see, this Halicarnassus is a character from a fictional story, even in the game's world. She is said to have been the antagonist in a tale from the 4th Astral Era. This popped out to me because Heidelin's historical eras correspond to major events from each of the shards, alternating from umbral to astral. This means that the 4th Astral Era would have been the 8th era in its history. So, this sorceress queen of Dimension Castle was the antagonist of a story from the 8th era. This sparked my curiosity in a major way, which led to me making basically all of the connections I've mentioned previously. But why would these seemingly unrelated characters share so many similarities, which would be quite deliberately, albeit subtly, brought to attention in this reference in 14? This is when I started digging into the meaning of the characters' names and noticed that Ultimecia's name was rather poorly understood. Although the French translation also called her Ultimecia, none of the others did. In particular, the Italian and German versions both translated her name as Artemisia, which struck me as plausibly correct. I knew this was a name from Greek history, but didn't know anything specifically about the person, so I checked Wikipedia. What did I find? Artemisia of Caria, Queen of Halicarnassus. Well, fuck me, there it is. This was so exciting to me because it clarified so much about her character design. Ultimecia, or Artemisia as I have discovered, was clearly an elaboration on the character design of Halicarnassus, and certainly a deliberate homage as well. It seems that the developers of 8 saw something interesting in the relatively simple concept of Halicarnassus in 5, and decided to use that as a starting point to build a more fleshed out character. Thus, we get Artemisia, the sorceress queen of a castle beyond time. She is the last in a line of sorceresses, many of whom have gender non-conforming traits. Perhaps that was something the developers even chose to be an inherent nature of a sorceress. The possibilities are multiple. In the end, this doesn't really change anything. Square has remained commendably consistent when it comes to the names of their characters, how they are spelled and pronounced. Ultimecia is here to stay, but with the discovery of Artemisia, we are enlightened to a delightful homage to a character who had long since been lost to the Rift. Thanks for watching.